Hi everyone, this is Jessica Ogden, who is nearly finished with a PhD from the University of Southampton. I'm going to briefly talk through some work that I did at the UK Web Archive back in 2018. So very brief background, this was a 3-month placement funded through the UKRI's ESRC, National Center for Research Methods, to examine the UK Web Archive for social science research. This is clearly in the context of previous research that's been done with the UK Web Archive, including projects like the Buddha Project, but also within a long history of social science engagement with secondary and archival data sources. And the remit was to develop a case study. And this case study, in order to sort of understand the remit for social science research, I took a semi-autoethnographic account of this research process. And the focus of the case study was on the discursive representations of migration and immigration in UK hyperlocal news. So this was off the back of a previous project called the Race and Nation Project, which looked at these representations within Twitter data. And here we wanted to expand it to think about it in the local news context. And as part of this research, I sort of started by doing a deep dive on mixed methods in other research contexts on online media, including Moore and Ramsey, to think about how these processes might parallel how a social science researcher would engage with the UK Web Archive. And so really briefly, I'll whiz through this kind of conceptual framework that I developed for how researchers would go about engaging in this kind of research, and what I broadly called orientating, auditing, and constructing. And this goes through a sort of spectrum of ways in which researchers have to orientate to these kind of new forms of data research as products, but also as process. And so thinking about how they unpick complex legal constraints as well as technical constraints, how they go through the process of auditing and what I've called reading against the archive, which will be familiar to people working in other archival spaces, thinking about how researchers might assess incompletenesses and characterizing what can be known using these sources. Ultimately, to construct a corpus through which to do the research. So that's sourcing links, and cobbling together sources from disparate calls and collections that may not actually align with particular collections that researchers need to answer the questions that they have. So these are some of the results of these processes of sort of auditing and creating the corpus. And some of this work is based on using the ACT tool. So this is the curation and records management tool that curators use at the UK Web Archive. So it's using some of the metadata of this hyperlocal news collection, and because the hyperlocal news has this sort of spatial component, I wanted to sort of think through how you could map these metadata to sort of understand the ways in which curators are managing this collection and sort of the impact that would have on the kinds of questions that I could ask. So this is sort of thinking through crawl frequency and curators. So ultimately I got to this kind of result, which is thinking through how hyperlocal news that mentions immigration and migration is mapped within the UK context. But ultimately the kind of processes of developing this corpus was somewhat fraught. And so here's some kind of brief reflections that I'll whiz through. First, the work was indicative of a considerable amount of time I spent auditing and constructing a corpus, which led me to think about what Edwards calls data friction, or the cost, time, energy, and attention required simply to collect, check, store, move, receive, and access data. So data friction in this context requires us to think about the materiality of web archives, the implications of these data sources as both product and process. So second, I was thinking about the kind of complexity of the web archive and this sort of various derivative data sets, combined with this friction that I mentioned, encountered when attempting to understand the ways in which records and snapshots relate. So they all produce this kind of urge to compute and quantify at some level, and this is what I'm calling the allure of computation. So to a certain extent, the use of multiple tools and technologies to experiment with web archives is part and parcel with this type of scholarly engagement. I acknowledge it's often exploratory, it's deductive, and it perhaps is no surprise that paradigms that support moving from big to small or macro to micro are employed in an attempt to reduce complexity. But I've kind of constantly found myself refraining, what does this metric actually mean, and how does it help me answer my research question? And it really reminded me of what Kennedy calls this sort of desire for numbers, where quantification becomes a technology of distance that allows us to view particular phenomena from afar. So here I ask whether this push to center, these kind of what she calls sort of computational tools of distance, are an attempt to encounter both counter both a deep distrust and lack of transparency surrounding the construction of web archives. Computation therefore becomes a means for reducing data friction, but what are their effects? And so finally, to conclude, how can researchers kind of come to grips with these resources that are kind of constantly in flux, right? How do we understand context and this need to understand context when they're constantly changing? And so I guess I want to put to the community sort of how do we continue to bridge the gaps to fruitfully understand these contingencies of web archives to engage social science researchers. Thanks very much, and a quick shout out to an acknowledgement to everyone who's supported this research. Cheers.